continued.
It is. Slowly. Oh, okay.
Oh, I think we're on.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Eileen, or IW Gregorio, and you can see Emily and Hanna and Farah. And we are so excited to welcome you guys all to the AAPI Book Month panel on mental health in Asian stories. So this panel is special in that it's co-hosted by Main Point Books, a wonderful indie here in southeastern Pennsylvania that I hope that everyone will support by buying all of our books. And if you don't really want to buy our books, you can buy another book from them. I personally don't care, but I think we could get their book. So, as you guys all know, indie bookstores play such an incredible role in the publishing ecosystem. Like, I'm so sad to be missing out on events where I can talk to readers and hang out with other authors. But I'm glad to be doing this virtually. I feel so energized after each one. So I think that we're going to start off by the four of us each just introducing ourselves and giving a quick elevator pitch of our book that we're going to be talking about today. Although we're not going to be talking about just our books. We're going to be talking about mental health in Asian cultures in general. So as I said, I'm Eileen. The book I'm talking about today is This Is My Brain in Love, which came out in April. Yeah, April. Sorry, lost time, sense of time and place in this pandemic. But our publishers like to pitch this as a mostly happy book about mental illness. And it's also a foodie rom-com. And it's an own voices story that's very closely informed by my own history growing up in sort of upstate New York, where in a family where anxiety and depression were considered American illnesses, and where I didn't really have the vocabulary to talk about that type of thing. But it's about two kids navigating financial stress, anxiety, and depression in a stressful time period. So I think that everyone can relate to it right now. I think Emily's going next.
I think it's on next, right?
Sorry.
Hi. Hi, I am Farah Rishi. I'm currently located in Philadelphia, so really close to Main Point Books, which I think I'm going to have to hit up as soon as I can. So I wrote, I Hope You Get This Message. It's the story of three teenagers. Oh, wait, I think I have. Hey. I was referencing it for something because I forgot half my book. This came out in October of last year. So it's a story of three teenagers, Jesse, Kate, and Nadeem, who is an own voices character because he is Pakistani, American, and Muslim. These three teens who, upon learning that aliens are deliberating the termination of the grand experiment that they call humanity, they decide to embark on three very different journeys to right their wrongs, settle their debts, and unite their families. For the mental illnesses that are kind of portrayed in here, Jesse has depression, and Kate's mother is struggling with schizophrenia. And one of the Muslim characters, not Nadeem, but another one, is coming out as gay to her family. So there's a lot of stuff that she's dealing with there. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm up. My name is Hanna Alkaf, and I'm the author of The Weight of Our Sky, which came out in February of last year. I am Malaysian, born and raised, Kuala Lumpur, born and raised. So I've been here most of my life, except for a 6-year blip I spent in Chicago. And The Weight of Our Sky is about a 16-year-old girl named Malathis who has what we recognize to be OCD, but believes that she is possessed by a jinn who holds her mind and her body hostage unless she adheres to a series of rituals to appease him. And because I'm not a very nice person, that wasn't enough. I put her in the middle of the biggest race riots that Kuala Lumpur has ever seen, which occurred on the 13th of May in 1969, and separated her from her mother. So the entire story is a week-long journey of Malathis trying to be reunited with her mother. Just your fun, light, typical beach read. Mental illness, racism, let's put it all together and see what we get. But yeah, that's my pitch.
I'm Emily XR Pan. I'm the author of The Astonishing Color of After, which is about this teenage girl who is biracial. Oh, thanks, Eileen. Product positioning. This teenage girl, she's biracial. She's part Taiwanese and Chinese, and she is part American. And she believes that when her mother, her Taiwanese mother, died by suicide, her mom turned into a bird. And so this girl, Lee, goes to Taiwan to try to find the bird and dig up all these family secrets that she never knew the answers to. And she has to reconcile the fact that in the same moment that her mother was dying, she was downstairs in her best friend's basement kissing him for the first time. He was a longtime crush of hers. And so it's these two really intense things in tension against each other. And it's the healing that allows them to start to come back to each other. So I think we're going to start with some questions, right? Eileen, you had something to give us.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I think this is going to be a really organic discussion, but we all had points that we wanted to bring up. So my question to all of you, which I guess I will also answer as well, is that when I was writing This Is My Brain in Love, I felt like one of my challenges was showing that my characters had mental illness, but not allowing it to define them. And so I'm curious as to how you all navigated that in your own process, because obviously there's a lot going on in our novels, and I don't know how you guys felt, but when I was, I remember when I first started writing, gosh, a decade ago, I remember feeling like I couldn't put any neuroatypia or any, quote, issues in, because it could be possible that a book has too many issues. And I think that's one of the things that drove me to be so involved in the We Need Diverse Books program, because there is this conventional wisdom that there could be too much diversity. But I feel like it's something that we're all bucking a little bit, hopefully, in all of our books, because we're showing that all of our lives are intersectional. There are all of these different identities that are struggling we're struggling to figure out where we are, where we live within those identities. And so can you talk a little about your process and what it was like writing these mental illnesses with nuance?
For me, it was really important. So Lee's mother has very severe depression, and it was important that there not be any specific reason for her depression. So I tried to paint her as still this very full character who is, an amazing pianist, who loves her daughter so much and makes these various cuisines that kind of mix East and West. And I wanted to carve her out into this very three-dimensional character. So she wasn't just the character with mental illness, which I think when we look back at a lot of really old literature, that's kind of sort of what you were talking about, Eileen, how this idea that, you can't have too much diversity. It's almost like back in the day, characters that were written with mental illness often were just written as these flat two-dimensional, like, this is all they are. And it's really dehumanizing.
Yeah, I think that's what's really important. That's the thing that's really important, is to remember that the character is a person, and to define them as such. So you allow them to be a person who has, likes and dislikes and friends and hobbies and relationships. And it's important to show all of those things. For me personally, while Malathis' mental illness is a big part of the story, while her OCD and this jinn that's controlling her, it's a big part of the story. I never wanted it to be the thing that defined who she is. I wanted to show that it was a part of who she is, and it's a thing that she has to struggle with for the rest of her life. But I never wanted it to be the one thing that defined who she was. So that was really, really important to me, and was a thing that I wanted to make sure came through, that she was a regular teenage girl as well for the time, given that it was in the 60s. But yeah, I think that, like what you said about making sure that these characters are three-dimensional and real, is a really, really important point.
I think for me, when I first started trying to tackle writing a character that had depression, it felt a little bit too close, because that was something that I had been dealing with for a long time. Like, while I was writing this book, it's kind of depressing, but like my whole family kind of passed away, and there was this whole thing in the background going on where I was dealing with my own like loss of my family, and now writing a story that was pretty much about the loss of the entire world. So I kind of had to push it away as far as I could. So every time I would do just like straight up research on how to portray depression in a way that was not harmful, I would kind of get like triggered by it, and it would really, really like put me kind of back in a spiral. So I had to find a way to be like, okay, how can I write about this in a way that doesn't feel like it's my own? So a lot of my research ended up happening in a very different way, where I would instead find books that I thought depicted depression in a way that really resonated with me, and I thought were also like really, really well done. So actually, The Astonishing Color of After was one of the books that I'd read that actually helped me kind of like distance myself and also talk about it in an effective way. And that was part of it too, was recognizing that like depression for me at least wasn't something that was like constant. It was something that would be a blip occasionally, and then one that would then quickly settle into something else. It's not a constant. It's, you know, like a process that you're dealing with. So yeah, for me, it was kind of unconventional, where I sought out books that did it well and clung to those and said, okay, if they can do it in a good, effective way, then surely, then if I put in the effort, then maybe I can do it too.
I don't even know that that's that unconventional. I think it makes so much sense for us to analyze the craft of anything else. You know, I think when going back to Eileen's point earlier, this idea of like, why is it that too much diversity was considered a problem at some point? And for us to embrace diversity now, it's not like we're just going down a grocery list and checking off boxes. It's that we want to do our due diligence to capture things as much as possible. And so I think whether you're reading a book in order to analyze the craft for how a subject so close to you is tackled, or whether you're reading a book to learn how something very far from you is tackled, it's all part of the craft process.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like one of the reasons that I feel like I felt so strongly about my depiction in this book is that growing up, I felt like there was such a binary regarding depression that, oh, if you're not thinking about harming yourself, you can't be depressed. You know, and for so long, I struggled with being able to seek out help because I felt like I wasn't depressed enough. And so it was really important in This Is My Brain in Love for me to show the spectrum of depression, because I feel like sometimes depressed people, they do have happy moments. And that's something that can sometimes be a red herring to people, so that they don't necessarily make sure that they need help. And I also think that internally, for me, it was something that really hampered my ability to seek out treatment of all sorts.
I think that's so important, because it really is like, we see all the you know, in media, the really damaging portrayals of like suicide attempts, and we don't see enough. There's not enough normalizing of like just even generalized anxiety, which so many people have. Like, I think most people have these days, and you know, like dysthymia, like a low level but sustained depression that definitely impacts your life. Like, it's so important.
Oh, sorry.
You're running away from us, Eileen.
Like, peace out.
But I think it really goes back to Emily's point about how she wanted to write about someone whose depression was not because of something. Because so many times when it's when it's a so-called reactionary depression, people think that it can be cured by circumstance. I feel like that's another like a thing that's sort of a characteristic, particularly within, I think, immigrant communities, or at least in my family, where people were like, you know, how dare you be depressed? You know, you have this, and this good things going on in your life. Think of all these people who have it worse off. So, Emily, did you?
That's a really great segue into the next question, which happens to be my question. When I was writing The Weight of Our Sky, one of the things that was very important for me to portray was this intersection of culture and faith and mental health, and how they all bleed into each other, because it's within this intersection that most of my community lives, right? And so it sounds fantastical to a lot of people to tell them, oh, my main character believes that she's being held hostage by a jinn. Like, it feels like a fantasy element, but actually jinn is part of Muslim belief, right? We believe in jinn. And so it would be very normal for us then to still, to this day, to have people say, this is the work of a jinn, or you're just being disturbed by a jinn, instead of recognizing it as a mental illness, right? So growing up, the depictions of mental illness that I got from Kidlit, being somebody who lives in Malaysia, who's from Malaysia and who lives in Malaysia, the depictions of mental illness that I got from Kidlit, first of all, if you were going to get them at all, which was rare, but if you got them, it was through a very Western lens, where I never saw this intersection play out, right? So did your, I think we've all touched on this a little bit. You got hints of it throughout our conversation, but did your cultural upbringings impact how you grew up thinking about mental health and mental illness? And how do you think this plays out in the fiction that you write?
I mean, absolutely. Like, coming from a Muslim family, like that was definitely a huge, huge impact. I mean, it wasn't until I started actually writing this kind of novel that I realized like how many internalized harmful ways, or I guess how many harmful ways I'd internalized thinking about mental illness in general, like hiding your feelings because, you know, you shouldn't put it out there, it might shame your family. Like just getting help would be somehow like a weakness and would also shame your family. I think that that concept of shame definitely powered like every single decision that I would make in terms of like my own struggles and just the struggles of others, I think. And also this idea that like everyone is fine. Like Eileen, you were talking about how like we should feel grateful, therefore you shouldn't be depressed. Like how could you possibly? So a lot of that was like teaching myself not to feel that way, which is still a constant struggle. And also providing, and I think that's kind of the healing aspect of writing, is that you get to write these characters who are kind of going through those processes and then kind of experiencing it with them. So that's kind of been therapeutic, at least for me. Yeah, but I think now the next step that I'm trying to see with my own writing, and I think I'm starting to see it with other people's writing too, is that we're kind of on the precipice of like a new generation that is getting increasingly more okay with talking about mental illness, which is a really fun space to be in, because now it's no longer like the really hard parent that's gonna like beat you because you talked about, you know, whatever. And now we're getting like our brothers or sisters talking about like, yeah, it's okay, go get help. Yeah, let's go get marriage counseling. It's normal now. And like our older, you know, generation parents and stuff like that are like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. But that's cool. So
the topic of shame, specifically in Asian cultures, I think is so integral to this entire conversation. I had this thought for a long time that the term losing face sounded so weird. Like it doesn't sound like any other English expression that we have. The way the verb and the noun are paired together it doesn't match the grammatical structure that we usually speak with. And I was like, it actually sounds like Mandarin transliterated Diolian, which literally means to lose your face, to have your face fall. And so I looked it up, and I think it was the Oxford English Dictionary that attributed the phrase to lose face to the British who were trading in China back in, I believe, the 1800s. So literally these were British people trading there who were learning like pidgin Chinese, and that was how the term got carried over. And that makes so much sense, because everything about Chinese culture is built around, all social etiquette in Chinese culture, I feel like, is built around preventing yourself from losing face, because the stakes are so much higher than in Western culture. If you lose face, you know, you might lose all your friends, your job, your, you know, prospects for marriage, your ability to exist in your community. Like the shame can be so permanent. And I think that I was definitely raised that way, and also raised by, you know, immigrants. Like I was born in the States, but my parents emigrated here from Taiwan. And so it goes back to that point of, you should be so grateful. We've worked so hard for you. You have such a better life than we could ever have imagined for ourselves when we were growing up. So literally, what is there that you could possibly be anxious or depressed about? And also, you know, you should never speak out about these things, because to claim like ownership over the fact that something would be wrong with you because they see mental illness as a defect, to share that publicly is the most direct way to lose face in the eyes of my family, you know. But there's also the interesting component. Hanna and Farah, you both touched on religion. I'm Buddhist. I was raised Buddhist, and my family, certain members are more religious than others, but I definitely have aunts and uncles who, like, they believe that if things are hard, you just go to the temple, you consult with monks, you just become more devout. Like the more you know, my family is the type of Buddhist that is the Buddhist equivalent of Christianity. So it's like, if you pray enough, if you, read the sutras enough, you go to a temple and you worship and you focus on becoming a better human, that fixes everything. And then you also have people like my mother. My mother's also very Buddhist, but not quite as Buddhist as the people I was just thinking of. But my mother is really existential with her Buddhism. So she thinks all children were brought into this world to suffer, and that is just the way that karma works. That's the way that the cycles work. And like literally, she said to me, you shouldn't have children because your children will just be brought into the world to suffer. And if things are going poorly, she, so easily defaults to being like, well, this is just like the way of things. Like, we all just suffer because that is what we're supposed to do as humans. Like, this caste that we are in is meant for suffering. And so but my family also, there's a lot of mental illness in my family. My immediate family especially has been much more progressive about addressing that than anyone else. And so for me, in my writing, I've been trying to explore that sort of, those boundaries where some of your family is maybe shut off to the idea of addressing mental illness and looking at it head on, and some of your family is more open to it or has had a change of heart about how to deal with it. And I also try to sort of tap into that Buddhist element of, there's that sense of denial, but also religion will fix everything, as so many people believe. And that became a weird thing to navigate because the two are so at odds with each other.
That's so interesting to me to hear all your stories, because my family was very agnostic, probably atheist a little bit growing up. And yet my family still had the same sort of biases against mental illness, because in some ways they, the people that they were worshiping the American success story, right? And so if you didn't have your handle on your emotions, you were considered to be a failure or flawed. And it took me a really, really long time to get over that, not only because of my background, but also because of the profession I chose. I mean, being a doctor and being a surgeon, I mean, the best thing you can tell a surgeon in residency is that they're strong, right? And so here I am, I'm literally the type of, we watched we finished watching the half of it, and also Never Have I Ever. I cried at the end of Never Have I Ever, okay? Which is like the cutest little comedy series. So I cried at Drop of a Hat. I cried in front of patients. I cried in front of other residents. And I remember for a long time just feeling such a broken physician because of that. And it wasn't until I became an attending and started really having to manage my own patients and have established relationships that I finally realized that my weakness is my strength. And it took a really, really long time to realize that my understanding of people's anxieties and of their feelings and their emotions made me a stronger person. But if anything, that's the one thing that I really wish that that I had been taught more growing up.
I think in my book in particular, a lot of the time, Malathi doesn't talk about her struggles because, first of all, she doesn't recognize them as such. She doesn't recognize the fact that it's an illness, and she doesn't have the vocabulary to be able to tell people that. But a lot of it is also just something that I internalized growing up, which isn't necessarily a sense of shame, but more a sense of, this is not a thing we talk about. We just don't talk about this. And I don't know if that's tied up in shame necessarily for me, as I just grew up with this idea of, this is something you keep private. You don't have to share this with other people. You don't need to do that. And so Malathi's struggle is very much a thing that I think a lot of us here deal with in Malaysia, but in general in this panel as well, is just, we don't talk about the things that are difficult. We don't need to let people see that. We handle that on our own. We don't have to make that public. So I think that's a lot of what I internalized growing up as well. We don't talk about sensitive issues. We'll skate over those. We'll talk about something more pleasant. We don't dwell on the things that are negative. And that's, I think, a big part of how I grew up thinking about mental illness, was that it was a thing that you were supposed to hide. Not necessarily out of shame, just it's not the done thing. So,
out of privacy rather than shame. There's a difference between shame and privacy.
Yeah, I think also for the families that do internalize the shame, a lot of it is because media has shown these, you know, like everybody can think of, you know, the scene where you see a character attempting suicide, or you see a character, you know, downing a bottle of pills or something, really harmful tropes that like are genuinely things that happen in the real world, but are, going back to what we were saying earlier, not the example of all mental illnesses. And just like any other identity or lived experience, it's not a monolith. And so I think that a lot of the time families are thinking, like, you hear depression and the older generations, their brains immediately are like, well, you're not like lying on the tiles of the bathroom floor completely useless and unable to move. And so like, no, like, why are you being so dramatic, you know? And I think that also because there is that stigma that is perpetuated by harmful media, there's so much harmful language circulating out there. I really want us to talk about language choice, you know, the words that we use and how they contribute to harmful stereotypes. I'm curious whether there's anything that you were very intentional to avoid or to change, or even anything you learned in the process of writing your book and being respectful of mental illness.
Control F was my best friend throughout the entire process. Like honestly, it was just kind of doing more research, trying to figure out what words I had internalized that I hadn't even thought of as super harmful. Words that I still kind of catch myself saying out loud when I'm in conversations, and I'm always like, ah, dang it, because it's just so ingrained, in just my everyday language, but also just society in general. Like so-and-so is so, like, if so-and-so said something silly, therefore they're like crazy. Like that's the word choice that we use, just constantly diminishing someone's like mental state at every turn, which is probably why internally we've decided not to ever talk about like actual mental illness, because you don't want to like seem crazy. I was just talking to someone about like wanting to, because my hair has just been doing some weird things. So I was like, oh, maybe I'll just like shave my head. And one of my friends was saying like, oh, but if you do that, like people will think you're pulling a Britney. As if somehow that's like, oh, well, then you're going to look crazy. Like that kind of language I had to start to like think about a lot more, just every day, and eliminating that. Because at the end of the day, it's just about writing something that is as harmless as possible. Like we're all going to say things that we don't mean, and we're going to mess up at times. But at the end of the day, it's just about like making sure the language is as good as possible. So that way we can produce the work that actually helps people instead of actually like harms them when they're reading.
Yeah, I definitely have specific instances where my characters question the language that they were using, because I think that, yes, crazy is a term that pretty much all teenagers, all adults use at some point, often sort of jokingly, but sometimes, you know, with intent to harm. And, you know, there's a scene in the book where one of the characters is like, you know, stop, you know, marginalizing yourself. And the other one's just like, I'm reclaiming the word crazy. So I think just acknowledging the tension, because not everyone feels comfortable using the same language. And gosh, and certainly I must date myself in that I definitely took a long time to come around to the terminology of death by suicide rather than, you know, committing suicide, because that's what I grew up with. And I still make that mistake sometimes.
Yeah, I think what Farah was saying about acknowledging what you grew up with and how you use the language as well, like these internal biases that you grow up with, I think that's really a really important step. And I think one thing that I would bring up that we haven't necessarily touched on is the subject of sensitivity reads. I thought that was a really important step for me personally, even though I was writing a good portion of that from my own experience. You don't know what your internal biases are until somebody points them out to you a lot of the time. So it was really important to me to find somebody who could read my manuscript for accuracy, and who lived in that intersection that I was talking about, particularly between like faith and OCD. It was really, really important to me to find somebody else to read it through that lens and make sure that I wasn't perpetuating any stereotypes with the way that I was presenting the story. Because I was so worried. I was so worried, especially growing up outside the US and, you know, growing up in the culture that I did. I was really worried that I didn't know what kind of biases that I was bringing to the table necessarily. So it was really important to me to get that other set of eyes on the book to make sure, and who existed in those intersections, to make sure that somebody was checking me and checking my language and checking my portrayals. Yeah, that was a thing that I felt was really important.
Yeah, I agree. I also, I had biracial people read my book because I'm not biracial. I wanted to make sure I was writing that aspect respectfully. I consulted with child psychologists and with adult psychologists to try to learn and try to educate myself about how I should be approaching certain scenes, like whether certain language might be too graphic. I actually changed some language that I had written that was meant to be lyrical, meant to be metaphorical, because I ultimately was like, that could be, you know, a little bit too triggering. I want to pull back. I obviously want to allow myself to be poetic, but I'm not going to, you know, be gratuitous with it. And also to address things like the terminology of dying by suicide, which the interesting thing about that, like you brought that up, Eileen, the interesting thing is how language is constantly shifting. So there are so many terms that have changed over the years. I'm thinking, for example, like even back to Eileen's debut novel, None of the Above, like decades ago, the word hermaphrodite was not considered offensive. Decades ago, hermaphrodite was considered, was it almost like a medical term? Like,
They used in textbooks. I have textbooks that say male pseudo-hermaphrodite. So it was, I mean, the medicine used the term for lack of a better term, if you know what I mean. But yeah.
Right. And but it's like now with more conversations and more education, people are starting to understand that the correct term, the more sensitive term, is intersex. And similarly, to say die by suicide instead of committed suicide, I think that's a relatively recent change, because the like people in the field of psychology who are advocating for that usage, they've had to work really hard to get that out there so that people are aware that there's this shift in language happening, because people don't realize it's still, you know, every time there's a celebrity who's died by suicide, that's what the headlines say. They say committed suicide. And, you know, you have to take a step back and realize, like, why are we changing the language? What are we equating suicide with when we use the word committing? You know, we make it sound like it's committing a sin, committing a crime. And I think so oftentimes when we're talking about the language, there are always the naysayers, the people who want to argue that, oh, I don't want to be so concerned about being politically correct, which really just ties into a conversation about privilege. Like, if you don't have to think about the language because the language is not potentially harming you, you hold privilege over people for whom that language is detrimental. That language is damaging, and they internalize it. And so this is like, it, you know, I think there are so many changes that we could think about on a daily basis. You can see I'm like very up in arms about this. Like, you know, I can't, like, I've lost track of how many times I've had a friend say, oh yeah, I'm really OCD about my bookcases, right? Casually throwing around the term OCD as figurative language, which is harmful because it erases the actual disorder that people deal with, that people really struggle with. You know, people who have severe OCD and are really working hard to try to fight it, to have their syndrome be turned into figurative language really diminishes it, which, not to say that we should be making everything out to sound really severe, but just that we should be respectful of things like that. The same way that we should be respectful of, are we using the word like like I'm paralyzed by something when we are not actually paralyzed, or, you know, the expression turn a blind eye to when we are actually sighted human beings who, you know, have not lost that sense. And so I think I really love this whole phase that's coming about in literature, especially children's publishing, where people are becoming so careful about the language. And thank goodness we have each other to have these conversations about it, and we have sensitivity readers. So
yeah.
Can I add one more thing that that I think that it's what's so great about YA right now is that I think that it's open to these discussions. It's open to having these discussions on the page, right? You know, because one of the things that was very important for me when I was writing this was to not gloss over the biases that people have against people with mental illness. You know, one of my characters, the one that I had to use the most sensitivity readers is mixed race Nigerian. And so I did have to do a lot of research and talking to people and interviewing them about how that culture, the Nigerian culture might potentially address those issues within their culture. And again, just like in Asian American cultures, it's anxiety and depression can be considered an American disease. And like figuring out the actual language that they use was important, not only so that you can show it, but also so that you can have the characters making that decision to identify that language and debunk it a little bit. Because, you know, I had like Emily brought up the use of the term hermaphrodite and none of the above. And yeah, I struggled a lot with whether or not to even use that language. But because so many people only identify intersex through the term hermaphrodite, I felt like I had to use it. But at the same time, there was that responsibility to debunk it and show how there's a better alternative. And, you know, the great thing is that I feel like my editors for sure, and we can talk about the editorial process if you guys want. They felt really open to talking about the importance of language. And one of the questions that someone has in the comments is how you feel about the idea of reclaiming the word crazy. And it's challenging because every person's going to have a different opinion on that. But because it's part of my vocabulary that I've been finding it difficult to excise, I've just started to try to normalize it. I like to say that crazy is the new normal. Because statistically, you know, someone that you know is going to have some problems with anxiety or depression. And the more it becomes the new normal, the less we stigmatize it, the safer people are going to feel comfortable talking about it. But it is really, really challenging.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that crazy should be like a derogatory term. Sorry, Hanna.
It's all right.
I don't think that crazy should be a derogatory term, and I think there's a lot of value in being like, in reclaiming crazy as a way of identifying a struggle, which I think takes the work of then not using the word crazy to just describe, you know, a really busy day at work, or, you know, somebody making like an impulsive decision to do something, like things that have no relation to mental struggles. I think that's the nuance there.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I wanted to point out was also that this entire conversation, and maybe that's also just a side effect of me also being published in the West, but this discussion of language is a pretty Western-centric conversation, right? And the fact that we're discussing terminology in English and all these things, these are pretty Western-centric conversations that we're having. And so I just wanted to point that out, because I think sometimes we get caught up in how things are done in certain parts of the world without necessarily thinking about other countries and how those intersections play out, and then how language has to evolve when it's not English. Because I think the complications of working around like Malay as a language, for example, to talk about the nuances of mental illness, that's a whole other cultural component that you have to deal with. So I do want to just point out that this experience, and I know this is AAPI month. And so the Asian American experience, therefore, isn't always the same for Asians who live in Asia or people who live in other countries in general. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Farah, you had a question for us, right?
Yeah. So I mean, this whole thing is like, you know, as children's book authors, we are kind of in a really unique position to shape the conversation. And I think it's really exciting to be a children's book writer right now. So on that note, what can we do to normalize seeking mental health care, especially for kids who are still living with parents that might have that stigma, or not just parents, but under the roof of family or whoever? Is there any resource that we could suggest to other people? And I think that's a hard one, because it's one of those things where it's like, well, how much power does anyone really have? But I think at least the first step is just writing about it in a way that's empowering and like as harmless as possible, in a way that can be a safe space for someone to explore kind of that aspect of their life where, you know, even in reality, they might not be able to think about their mental health. Well, at least they can kind of feel it through this character. But also just like actual resources, like places where they could call. One of the issues in my book is that there's a Muslim character who comes out to her family and doesn't really have a place to go after they don't have the reaction that she would like. So that's kind of something that's been really, really important to me. So one resource that I found, which I thought was really cool, is this group called nasiha.org. And it's this confidential anonymous hotline for Muslim youth. But unfortunately, it's only Western. But there's also another group called the Muslim Mental Health Organization, and they have like a bunch of resources. And there's that. But I'm really curious to see if there's anything that you all have come across, maybe in your writing or anything like that.
I'd like to give a shout out to a really wonderful newsletter / support system called Foreign Bodies, and it's 4N Bodies on Twitter. And it's a project born out of the Carter Center Mental Health Program that specifically centers immigrant and refugee experiences with a mission to destigmatize mental illness and encourage personal storytelling. And so that's a really great resource because it sends out a weekly roundup of different articles that might be of interest, and also invites people to tell their stories. Because as Hanna was sort of talking about, how obviously privacy is something we want to respect. The ability to tell your story, though, and the ability for kids to see the stories of people who, you know, they deem, you know, successful or having survived it, is really important for showing them, modeling them. Because I feel like I never had a model for someone successfully navigating mental illness. The only thing I heard about was the daughter of my grand uncle, who was incidentally a psychiatrist who died by suicide. So, I mean, the great thing is that things are like athletes. You know, Lance Armstrong is writing about his depression. There are so many countless stories now of people who are, you know, considered to be at the top of their fields, who show that there is a way through mental illness. And that's, I think, one of the best resources out there, as well as depictions on screen of therapy. I think that's important too, because even though it's challenging, because it can be challenging, especially for people of color, to find therapists. And on my webpage, I also have a list of certain resources for people of color to find therapists. There's a Muslims Thrive mental health resource and registry of professionals. Hyphen magazine also has Asian American specific mental health resources. And there are also resources for queer and trans therapists of color as well as therapy for Black girls.
And speaking of seeing therapy on screen or in the pages, I think it's especially important that we see good therapy relationships. Like there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of media out there that sort of brushes off therapy or makes it seem like therapists are always annoying, or, you know, like nobody likes going to therapy. I love therapy. I love my therapist. She's one of the most important people in my life. And I think it's so important to try to capture that in what we write, to show that there can be really beneficial relationships, and also to show that maybe, you know, a therapist isn't the right match and you can try a new one. Like, just because one therapist is not the right match doesn't mean that you give up on therapy forever. a resource that I want to talk about is this app that was created by two teenagers. They are a sister-brother duo. They created the Not Okay app. That's NOTOKAPP. So that if you are struggling and you basically need to send out an SOS call, you can push a button and it'll blast out a message to, you know, preloaded contacts, people who you trust, to tell them to either call you or come find you right now, because you might not be in that headspace to craft a whole message or pick up the phone and call someone. And they made that app because the older sister, she was struggling with depression herself, and she felt this need for it. So they literally built this app together. And I think that's an amazing resource for teens, especially if they're in a household where they feel like they can't reach out to parents. Maybe they can preload friends in their contacts. And also, if you're based in the United States, there is a crisis text line. I know a lot of people have phone anxiety these days, but you can text 741-741 in order to speak to somebody who is equipped to hold space for you and help you navigate what you're going through.
So when it came to this question, when we were discussing this before the panel actually began, I was a little worried about what kind of resources I would share, just because I am based in Malaysia, and I don't necessarily have a lot of resources that are US based. So I just really wanted to share this link, which Kat will post in the chat. It's basically a link of Southeast Asian startups that are all dealing with mental health in different ways, that work in the mental health space. So there are startups in Vietnam and in Malaysia and in Singapore and in the Philippines and in Indonesia. Like, there's a really cool app in Indonesia where if you you can basically access an on-call therapist at any time if you need to, for like, and sign up for like an online like therapy session as soon as you need it, if you feel like you're in distress, and it's confidential, and it's, you know, it's culturally specific, which I think is really important. That these are programs and apps and things that are tailored specifically for the communities that they operate in. And I think that's really important. I think that's a portrayal that I think somebody asked in the chat as well, any ways that you can see therapy or support groups or medication written in stories that could be improved. And I think that's one of those things. I think that a lot of the depictions of mental illness, as I said previously, and of treatment, are those that come from a very Western lens, or a very white lens, a very American lens. And it doesn't necessarily apply when you're Asian, or when you're in Southeast Asia, or even if you're Asian American and you come from a certain community, like it just doesn't always apply. And so there are studies that I've seen that actually, in the course of researching this book, where that actually show that if you are a person of faith, of a particular faith, then there is a way to integrate that faith in the treatment that you receive, in the actual like psychological or psychiatric treatment that you receive, and that actually helps with recovery if you are a person of faith. And we don't see a lot of that here. It has to be one or the other. Like, if you are a person of faith, it doesn't count when you're being treated for mental illness and things like that. And I just think it's really important that we take these cultural nuances into account when we, not only when we talk about mental illness, but when we talk about treatment for mental illness. So yeah.
It kind of feels to me like it's just like any other thing that we're trying to treat. We have to deal with our minds and our bodies holistically. So, you know, if you're sick, like, only eating ginger is not going to fix your problems. You know, if you're
Tell it to my grandmother.
if you're diabetic, you don't just like chug insulin all day. Like, you have to balance everything, you know. And so for some people, going to therapy is not going to be enough. They're going to need to build in self-care routines. They're going to need to have conversations with family in order to set boundaries. They're going to need to find maybe a mindfulness coach all on top of therapy. Maybe they need to find like a form of exercise that can help calm them down. There's any number of things that they might need to do to balance it. And religion is such an important component of life for so many people that it only makes sense that it would not be one or the other.
Yeah.
There's a question that we got in the chat that I'd love to address. How would you suggest I explain to my friends and family why I don't want to use certain language without having them call me too sensitive about things? I think that this goes back to that conversation about privilege. If I don't have to give a second thought to the usage of a word or a phrase, then, I am only accounting for myself. I'm not accounting for people who might be impacted by my words. And so I'm interested in being as compassionate as possible in my language. And that's what I try to present to people. And oftentimes people don't want to be told, this is like not the correct way to say things. Like that kind of is too brusque. It's a little bit, people don't like being told that they've overstepped or that they've done something wrong. There's the immediate instinct to be defensive. And so a really wonderful tactic is to be like, I actually was reading this article, or like, I actually learned this thing from taking a class or watching some informational thing on YouTube. And I learned that this language is actually considered harmful. And these are the reasons why it's considered harmful. And so I'm trying to change the use of my language. And I would really appreciate if you would change the use of your language. But if that feels too hard for you to at least respect that I'm trying to change my language, because I know that there are people within my immediate network who will be impacted by it, and I care deeply about them.
So it's almost like you're sharing a cool fact with them as opposed to immediately going on the attack, which is, I think, our gut reaction to these things. Like, you can't use that word. Why are you using that word? Right.
Right. Or, oftentimes people, I also like, my way of doing it with friends often is that I don't only call out things that are specific to me or specific to things that I am, like mental illness is something that I can get really up in arms about. I don't only call out harmful things if they're talking about mental illness. I'll call out if they use like a really problematic term about Indigenous people. And I know that because I've been trying to educate myself, and I'll be like, that's actually not a great term to use for X, Y, and Z reasons. And the more that I do it, the more it just becomes a natural part of the conversation that I have with people that I care about. And sometimes I just treat it as like casual conversational, as a way to normalize the fact that language is perpetually evolving. And we can be mindful of these things. It doesn't have to be an exhausting, like, let me open up this textbook of what's the correct way to speak. It can be like a gradual learning that can happen in our everyday conversation.
I think part of the tricky part of this also as well is that a lot of these conversations that you might need to have aren't necessarily just with your friends or with your peers or with people around in your age group, but also in the way that we talk to people who are older than us, and having to explain to them that certain terms are no longer encouraged. And that's difficult, I think, for us, because we grow up in a culture and an upbringing where we're not supposed to question our elders. We're supposed to accept, or at least that's how I grew up. We're supposed to, they know more than we do, right? Like the term here, they've tasted more salt than we have. And so it's hard, I think, in those instances when you have to explain to somebody older and you have to stand your ground and say, no, this is how I'm going to do it. And I would appreciate if you did it, but it's really hard to find it in you to say that to someone older than you when that's how you've grown up, and that's how that's how they've grown up. And I don't have a solid answer for that, because I'm still learning that process, and I'm 35. Like, I'm still trying to figure out how to explain to my parents why certain things shouldn't be said and can't be said and are hurtful. And it's difficult. And I think what I wanted to say was that you can try your best. You should try your best. You definitely should try. But at some point, if that struggle is impacting you in a way that is negative and is taking away from how you experience your life and your relationships with these people that are important to you, as long as you've tried, I think at some point it's okay to step back as well and be like, you know, I need to I need to protect myself as well, and this struggle might not always be worth it for people who are really entrenched and ingrained in how they've grown up thinking about these things. I just wanted to put it out there that you can't fix everybody.
That's a good point.
You know, and you shouldn't take on that responsibility. But it's good to try. It's good to try. It's always good to try. But just coming from a place where I know the older people in my life really well, sometimes those conversations won't go anywhere, and it's okay. Like, you don't have to feel like you failed because of it. Yeah.
It's also it's such a good point, because we also, so many of us who are really passionate about this type of thing, about improving our language, it's genuinely emotional labor to do that work, to educate other people, to be like, this is why it's harmful. This is why it's, like, if it resonates with me so much because I have felt harmed by similar language before. And so I think it is really important to guard your own mental health and to set those boundaries. Like, there have definitely been times with my older family members. I mean, good point, Hanna, like the filial piety, right? In Asian culture, we'll never escape it.
We can.
There have been times, right? There have been so many times when I've had to be like, okay, I hate to say this, but we just have to agree to disagree, because I do not have mental capacity to continue this conversation. And I think for my parents, that was really jarring when I first started like drawing the line, being like, I can't, like, we cannot, this debate is going nowhere. And it's also like, there's nothing to be debated. You're just being stubborn. And so I'm going to retreat to guard my own mental health.
I think obviously it's a different thing if it's family or friends, or if it's, some rando on the internet. I think that with family and friends, if they realize that you're not just angry about it, that you're actually hurt by it, I mean, obviously, hopefully they care. And if they don't, someone just asked, how do you determine when to give up or keep trying? When people willingly hurt you, I think that anyone would be in their rights to stop trying at that point, because it's always hard to parse out people's intents, but usually if they are a true family or a friend, they will either back down or at least stop pushing the issue when they realize that they're causing actual hurt and pain. And that's one of those situations where, and I struggle sometimes to try to hide my feelings, to try to be strong and not show when I'm vulnerable. But that's one of those situations where vulnerability is a weapon, right? Something that hopefully speaks louder than any shouting or anger or, confrontation.
I found that people who care about you are very careful when you show that vulnerability and you show that specific words impact you personally. But it's harder when it's a more generalized, like, we're talking about other people kind of thing. It's so much harder to change anything.
Although I have noticed that, like, at least in some discussions, and I'm sure this happened to all of us at one point, like when you're talking to someone who does love you, your parents, and you have this big argument and you do the whole, like, as Emily said, a strategic retreat, then a couple of weeks down the line, you'll notice that they start to change their language without ever admitting that argument happened.
Yeah. Sometimes that's the process that they have to go through.
Because they don't want to admit it. But at the same time, like, if you give them time to mull on it, if they love you and, you did your best and all that, and you're like, okay, I'm putting distance between us because this is going nowhere, sometimes it does work. So it's really hard to find that balance, I think. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it will work and you just won't even know that it worked. So, I mean, if you're in a good space to do it, it's always good to say something.
Right. And I think Kat said it's last question time. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Can I just say?
I want to see all of them. Oh wait, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just this is kind of not necessarily, or maybe it is, but like, you know how growing up, like I never heard my parents say "I love you" casually, and I feel like that's something that I also really want to see. Like we talk a lot about, you know, all the harmful things and you know, harmful things that are said and things that are just not said, but also just a simple "I love you" is something that I feel like is never said, also in part because it's like perceived as weakness or just like a weird thing to say in a lot of Asian families. That's of course a stereotype, and there's exceptions to that rule, but that's something I kind of is always on my mind. Like when we do see depictions of mental illness, a lot of times it's like stuff that's reached a fever pitch, the worst of the worst. But I think, Emily, you had talked about this earlier. It'd be really nice to see like the good, the normal, the living with things that are like hard, but like getting through it in an okay state because either you have support or you're figuring it out yourself, and then having like your family say "I love you" like casually, I think would be that would be nice.
And just like I love this question. I don't know if everybody can see it, but the question is, what kinds of stories about mental health and illness do you want to see in the future? I love this question so much because the answer to me feels obvious. I want to see all of the stories. I want to see mental illness represented at every level. I want to see people who, you know, they have obsessive compulsive disorder, but it's not like impeding their entire life, but they still clinically have it.
Right.
And I want to see people who, you know, they casually mention, oh, you know, yeah, I got to go pick up my meds because I'm taking SSRIs to help with my depression, you know, to balance out the brain chemistry. I want to see people who are, you know, talking about, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't respond to your text. I had a bad mental health day, but like I'm firing on all cylinders again. I think to normalize, you know, healthy exchanges, to, as Eileen talks about so much, this idea that you have to sort of build in the reality of negative and harmful things so that you can unpack it on the page. You know, I think it's really important for us to get to see negative responses that we can then unpack and have our characters be like, but wait, do you see how that reaction was harmful to me? Or can you try to change and be better because this is actually what I need from you? I want to see all of it.
I want to see the story about mental illness that blows up the whole idea. So I feel like the whole term mental illness is like kind of a misnomer, right? Because the idea that calling something mental implies that it's all in your brain, and like it's chemistry. It's brain chemistry, right? And like it took me decades as a doctor to actually internalize that. And I talk that a lot in the afterword for my book, that I've had this complicated relationship with medications, and that like I've sort of like had an on and off relationship. Like every time I feel better, I'm like, oh, I'm good. I want to get off of it because it's a machismo thing. You know, I don't want to seem weak once again. But it took like the third time on antidepressants for someone to finally tell me, my therapist, to finally say, you know, Eileen, your brain just needs serotonin. And like, I would never, as Emily mentioned before, I would never deny a diabetic person insulin. Why was I denying myself serotonin? And I feel like we should create a new term for it that doesn't imply that it's quote only mental, but realize, as Emily says, that it's a mind. There's a mind-body connection. It's not purely psychological. It's also like physical. There are physical reactions to stress and to anxiety, and there are actual chemical imbalances that are the basis for all of this. And the fact that so many people deny themselves that chemical balance is, to me, really problematic.
Wait, can I nerd out for a second to piggyback on that? SSRI stands for, it's
selective serotonin reuptake.
Let the doctor answer that.
Well, and I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like my understanding is that your body produces serotonin and then it reabsorbs it and your cells use it up. And so when you're low on serotonin, you take an SSRI so that your cells, it literally blocks the absorption into the cells. And what I love about this fact is that it's mostly happening in your stomach. So for people who think that it's just mental illness, you know, like what you were saying, to treat it like it's something that's just in the brain, the whole serotonin process is literally in your stomach, which
What?
don't tell me the stomach is part of my brain.
Totally.
I always knew my stomach was part of my brain, but I didn't really.
That's therapy for me. So yes.
100%. For me, the answer to this question is the answer to any question where you ask me what kind of stories you want to see. And that is that I want to see more stories that are set in different cultures and not necessarily set in the US, not necessarily set in the West in general. I want to see more stories that are set outside of the US in mainstream kid lit available all over the world. And I want to see depictions of mental illness as they play out in different cultures that aren't filtered through a Western lens. And I think those are really important for kids to have. We talk about windows and mirrors all the time. And kids like me, we grow up with a lot of windows and not necessarily any mirrors. And there are so many people who live in those intersections that I was talking about, who live in those intersections of culture and faith and mental health that still don't have mirrors, that still don't get to see mirrors. And so what I would really, really like is just more stories set in different cultures that normalize mental illness within those cultures. That's what I'd like to see.
Love it.
That was the last question, I think.
All right.
Sad to have this conversation to end, but we can keep it alive on the internet. So everyone feel free to follow us all on Twitter and Instagram. I think we're usually pretty responsive. And again, hopefully this is a discussion that we'll be having not just on Mental Health Month and Asian Pacific American Month, but every month out of the year. Thank you so much for coming to this panel. And remember, there's still a few more days left in the month. And please check out the full schedule on AsianAuthorAlliance.com. There are some amazing final wrap-up things this weekend.
Also, shout out to Kat Cho, who is who literally organized this entire month of events. And I don't know how she does it or has the brain capacity for it in a pandemic of all time to be like tech support for all of us. She's the one who's been throwing questions up on the screen and whatnot. So applause for her.
Yeah. And if you don't want to buy our books from Main Point Books, buy her Wicked Fox from Main Point Books, because everyone should read that. It's just such a amazingly written, cool fan.
Yes.
Is it? It's not really. It's Korean inspired fantasy, but it's also contemporary. It's what's the word? Urban fantasy-ish. Yes, that's it. All right. And thank you so much to Main Point Books for helping us to promote this. And yes, support our indie bookstores. We want to meet you all in person at one soon. So make sure that they survive the pandemic.
Bye, all.